Hey everybody, we're going to talk about federalism today, which goes along with our discussion about the Constitution. We have a federal system of government. What we don't have is a unitary system of government or a confederation or a confederated system of government. In a confederated system of government, the states and locals have more power over the centralized government, and essentially there is no centralized government either. In a unitary system, the power resides in that centralized government, and the states and local governments act as vehicles to implement those national laws. In a federal system of government, we have a sharing and distribution of power and resources between the federal government and the states. Enumerated powers are specifically written in Article 1 of the Constitution. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution gives us our reserve powers. You'll find concurrent powers in both the federal government and the states, such as taxation, and then prohibited powers are powers that are denied both to the federal government and the states and locals. Like I've said, Article 1 gives us our enumerated powers, but we also stretch the powers of the legislative branch with something that we call the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. You'll also notice that they are called implied powers, which stretch and give more broader powers to the legislative branch than are actually written. In our early days of our national government, we had a broad expansion of power of our federal government coming from the Marshall Court in cases like McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden. We also had the Alien and Sedition Acts that would punish people for speaking out against the executive branch. We've had many forms of federalism throughout the years. The earliest form is dual federalism, which specifically says what the federal government can do and what the states can do, and they both basically act like two separate governments at the same time. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are typically called the Civil War Amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th Amendment granted due process under the law, and the 15th Amendment gave all males the right to vote. During the period of commerce, where we had this big expansion of big business at the time, we also had a reaction to it. We would call that the progressive period, where people would speak out against the wrongs of big business and try to change the way government had behaved at that time. You had more of an expansion of the federal government during the New Deal after Franklin Roosevelt was elected into the presidency, and he served for 3 full terms, died in his first year of his 4th term. The New Deal regulations that took place in the 1930s you could still find today in the United States. Cooperative federalism, such as the interstate highway system, brings together the federal government and states to act as partners in solving public policy problems. Creative federalism expanded the rights of historically disadvantaged citizens in the 1960s through the 1970s. We will talk more about that with civil rights and how rights were protected for disadvantaged people, like I said before, whether it be Black, Hispanic, Asian Americans, and then we get into talking about those who are disabled, women, and then also people who are gay and lesbian, and how their rights are protected. And it really comes from this creative federalism period. Also, during the creative federalism period, it's the last time that you'll find a president such as Richard Nixon, who was a Republican, create something called revenue sharing, where he wanted money from the federal government to go to the states and local governments to fix their problems. That program ended in the 1980s under another Republican, Ronald Reagan. Since that time, we've had the idea of devolution or de-evolution, where we're going to cut the size of the federal government and give more powers to the states and locals. And also this time, we have grant and mandate programs. When it comes to grants, we have what are called categorical grants, where the federal government will give the states money for specific problems that are determined by the federal government. Block grants, there's more flexibility there. A state or a local government would apply for a block grant. The federal government would give them the money, and in return, the state or local government would decide for themselves on how that money is spent. We also have mandates, where the federal government will make the states or the locals jump through some hoops in order to get something in return. They have to meet a requirement or a mandate to get that financial support that they want. What you have found throughout the last few years, I should say, is that the federal government has been giving unfunded mandates, which means that the states and local governments must jump through some hoops, but at the same time, they'll get nothing for it. Hence, it's called an unfunded mandate. You'll notice that the federal government in the last decade or so is favoring unfunded mandates and also favoring more categorical grants rather than block grants.